Welcome to the Holistic Programmer for coding and health tips with your host, Brian Kidd.
All right, hello everyone. This is Brian Kidd, aka the Holistic Programmer. I wanted to do a video, sort of a nostalgic retrospective video, to kind of look back on a site that I did 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years ago in about October. A site that I did when I went back to school at Cascadia College in the Seattle area. Originally, I went to school for journalism. I went to the University of Washington for journalism and music. And as some of you out there probably know, sometimes things change. You change, your career path, passions change. You know, speaking of passion, I have a saying, I think it's me because I created it, but just because you think it's yours doesn't mean it is. But my saying is, when your passion exceeds your fear, you found your career. And believe me, this is very intimidating to go back to school 10 years ago to study web application development at Cascadia. But I just knew that it was something that I'd been passionate about, at least as a hobby, for 10 years after graduating from college originally. You know, it's interesting because it's like a 10-year cycle, right? And this is what's interesting about that is I once had a person tell me, a fairly famous person actually, that, and the reason I met this fairly famous person is because of journalism. I wrote an article when I was at the University of Washington for the movie Waking Life, which is directed by Richard Linklater. And I interviewed Richard Linklater about the movie. And what's interesting is one of the things he said in our interview was kind of a side note is you'll notice in life that you kind of go through these 10-year cycles where you move forward a decade and you're kind of like moving, hopefully progressing, but you're in the same spot. So it's kind of like you're like going around and you're going upwards and you're up and it's like, oh my God, I'm having deja vu, right? And I've recently been having that. And it's a good thing actually in this case, because when I started my journey into web development, my conception of what I wanted to do was something that didn't necessarily happen after I graduated from going to school and the path that I was on. I thought I made a mistake. It wasn't until recently that I realized the conception that I had of what I wanted to be, the only thing I could describe it with modern terminology is a UX engineer, which means sort of a combination of a front-end developer and also a UX designer, right? Kind of a intermediary between the two, but able to do both and enjoy both as well. So, but when I started working in the field, it didn't really seem like there was anything that really fit that. But I've been seeing job descriptions that almost look like I wrote the job description, right? Working with Figma and also able, to take Figma designs and create React websites or React apps. I'm like, whoa, that's pretty much what I want to do, what I do. So that's exciting. And I guess just to maybe inspire anybody that happens to be watching this, is you might think that you're on the right path. Instinctually, you think you are, but things aren't coming, they're not, evolving the way that you thought, or it's not the same as you thought. Just keep the faith, basically. Like I did. Oftentimes I felt like just quitting, to tell you the truth, because it wasn't what I thought it was. But since I stuck with it over the last 10 years, like Richard Linklater said, I'm back at that same spot, but with a different perspective, and it's a positive for sure. So, enough of that. That should probably be a totally different video, different topic, maybe for a different time. But see, this is a website that I created my first quarter going back to school at Cascadia with a group. So there was two groups. One group did a different website for, I think, a University of Washington Bothell lab. So the University of Washington is on the same campus as Cascadia. And they did a website for them. And for one of the labs. And we did a website for a local mom and pop diner called Steve's Cafe. And we basically we used a template. The class was like basic HTML and CSS, a little bit of CSS and basic JavaScript. And so Steve and Marlene Hoffer, they owned the restaurant. It's no longer around, unfortunately. But they were older when they started it, and they decided to retire. So this is Steve and Marlene Hoffer. Marlene's hilarious. She's very clever, very smart, very witty, kind of your typical, almost like old school diner waitress. Will it be sugar? Kind of, what'll it be, honey? Not like totally like that, but definitely wisecracking, witty. And Steve, he's the cook. He worked in the back. I think he was their only cook, usually. I think they might have had some help, and obviously the restaurant is named after Steve. So, someone from Cascadia knew about this place and suggested that a group make a website for the restaurant. And that's what we did. And get this off. And so, this is the website. So as you see, it's totally old school. It doesn't really fill the whole screen. It looks good on like old screen resolutions like 1366 by 768 or 1024 by 768. It didn't really look good on mobile. It looked okay on tablet. It was just basic, but it fit their needs. And by the way, that's me right there, and my mom. We were in one of the pictures, and the pictures that you see that kind of scroll through, or they used to. This is on the Wayback Machine because I don't have the original. I do have it somewhere. Yeah, I see it scrolling through a little bit, but I wasn't able to find it quickly, so I'll probably find it some other time. But this is on the Wayback Machine, so this was actually published. And this is what the site looked like. Now, one of the reasons that Marlene wanted the website is because she thought she wanted to control some of the reviews that the restaurant was getting. Most of the reviews were very favorable, very flattering. But because of her personality, sometimes you would get, and I think she's hilarious, but there were some people that maybe, the only negatives for the most part were maybe like the menu is not as big as some places, but some of them were also like, Marlene, something to the effect of like she's always making jokes and sometimes we just want to eat or something stupid like that, So, that could be one part of the reason that she wanted to control how people would see reviews. And so originally there wasn't even a review section, right? There was everything here except the reviews was something we had to add later. So later being an internship that I did the next, I think 2 quarters later. So the website was kind of like just home, our menu. So it basically looked the same in terms of layout. So it just had the menu and the location and the reviews and everything else. So here's the reviews. This is what it ended up eventually being. Back then, I think it was just like all the reviews listed out. Yeah. So they just would list out, with an overflow auto or something in this div. And then here's the thing: is the way I did the reviews is I had someone, you can click here, and it goes to a Google form, right? So you fill it out, and then you sign into your whatever your Gmail is, and then you go to Documents, and there's Forms, and it goes to a Google Sheet, I think it's called, or whatever they call their sort of Excel type sheets, and then all the data is there. So the user would fill this out, and then you would see the review, and if the review was favorable, then I would post it to the website like I did here. And so then I created it so I used jQuery so you could go through all the different reviews like this and go backwards. So there's like 10 reviews or something like that, and I would change them occasionally inside of the HTML. And I could probably put some of these documents up. You can kind of see some of the code if you're curious. But at this time when I did this, I had a friend who said, why don't you just use Yelp's reviews and have them, come through an API and have, go through the JSON data and just post it to the DOM, basically append it to the DOM. And I was like, yeah, I could do that, but Marlene she wants to control what reviews are there, and that's a good idea. You don't want bad reviews on your website necessarily, even though most of the reviews for her restaurant were really pretty good. But it is an important skill to be able to take JSON data and append it to the DOM. I mean, you see that all the time in job descriptions. And so I decided in order to be a little more nostalgic even, I'd go back and do what my friend suggested, and that is take Yelp data, take the JSON data through the Yelp API and show the reviews. Now with Yelp, the thing about Yelp, they only show a preview of the review, and they only let you have the three main, I think they're the three top reviews, the three top feature reviews. So if you look here, you have Michelle B, Rebecca L, I think that is, or Rebecca I can't tell, and then Michelle C. Michelle B, Michelle C, I'm not sure. So if you come here, you'll see that Rebecca I, and you go to the next one, Michelle, right? So these are the reviews. I'm looking here, I think it goes through the JSON data. So Michelle, Rebecca, and then Michelle. So when it loads, let me see here. Oh, shoot. Okay, let's see the error here. I might have made too many requests today, which is good. I'm glad this happened because I can show you some of the stuff that was happening to me when it says, okay, says forbidden. Now, here's something interesting. The reason that happened is because I need to make sure I'm connected to this proxy, right? I believe this is the issue. It's not a CORS issue though, but let's see if this helps, if this works, and I can show you why that helps. Yep, that was the problem. Okay, so I'm going to get to that in a second. But looking at the, oops, it does that sometimes with the, so here's all the reviews. So it starts out and it loads, I think the first review, which is, it says here it's Rebecca I. That's interesting because here, the way the JSON data comes in, let's see how the JSON data comes in. I did a console log. Because the way the JSON data comes in might not be the same as what's shown on Yelp. So let's look at the JSON data itself. And it starts with who? The user. So here's the, okay, it says Rebecca I. So that's correct. I'm not sure why it shows up differently on Yelp. But at any rate, here's the JSON data. So I actually had to use, this is when the data comes in originally, and I used the data.reviews. So I'm using the reviews from the JSON data, and I'll show you kind of how I did that. So let's go through this. Now, my API keys here, whatever, I can always change it. If you want to copy all that, sure, and use it for nefarious purposes, go for it. Here's my, so here's the headers, and so this is something else. This right now, the site's not live. This is in development, so I'll probably make another video when I put it live and explain why I had to use this. It's for CORS issues. So if you don't use a proxy server for the most part, and you're not getting data, so you're getting data from not the same server that you're working on, right? You're getting data from another server. Cross-origin resource sharing, there's some security issues with that. Again, probably for another video. But one way to get over that CORS error is to use this code right here. Again, this will be in the description. And when you use that proxy server, it'll allow you to make CORS requests. Okay, I'm not talking about the banquet beer. Okay, I'm talking about CORS requests, cross-origin resource sharing. So I was able to do that, and basically using that API endpoint. Okay, so then here's the part of the DOM where the information is going to be appended to, right here, reviews, right? So going back to the, okay, so going back to the JavaScript, don't need to go into a lot of details, although if you're interested, I could do another video on that. I think you can, if you're familiar with fetch and you're familiar with how to get the data, you can kind of follow along here. So here comes the data, and then so this is where I'm actually getting the data, and then I create another function for the payload, right? So I'm calling this get data, and then the payload is going to have to be .reviews. I showed you why that is, right? Because when you originally get the payload, it comes in as these three nodes, I guess you might say, and I'm using, so this is payload .reviews, and that's this data object here, right? And so that comes in, and then I do an initial render, right? So I take that data, okay, and I pass it through. So if you look at, probably wondering, where's this data being passed? Well, the data set being passed here to the initial render. And then I just want to show the first review, right? So I just take that data, and here's just a link, for the link. I created a variable for that, and I took the data and I appended it to that display. So where is that? So we did the display right here. So we did that and the inner HTML, and I just used a template literal, and I went through element.rating, element.text. Here's the link. I could have done some destructuring here. I can probably do another video on that. You can just structure it a certain way. Don't worry about that. This is thinking out loud. But at any rate, this works. And so when the data, so if you look at the initial render, that's when I call, right? So this is when we refresh the page, and then I should put a loading there or something, but that's the initial render, right? But you want to be able to go through the data. There's only 3, so I just did a next review. I didn't do a back button, but there's 3 of them. So for that, I did a click through data, right? And so for that, basically what you're doing is you're going through, with a click event, you're scrolling through the data itself, and you're only showing one at a time, right? You're only showing one review at a time. As you click through it, it shows one review. And what's interesting here, you might wonder, I always wanted a use case for modulus. The reason this works is because as it goes through the counter, right, it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, and it would keep going, right? At 3, though, you don't want 3 because you only have 0, 1, 2. So once it gets to 3, this modulus makes it go back to 0. So you're able to scroll. It doesn't end. You can just keep scrolling through, and once you get to 0, 1, 2, it goes back to 0. So in other words, this behavior right here. So if I do the initial render, it goes, okay, that's initial render. That's 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and it just goes through without stopping and trying to go any further. So that's a really good use case for the modulus there. And I can explain that. I guess the best way to explain that is that without that, it would go 0, 1, 2. And even if you had 3, that would be outside the bounds of the array, so it would throw an error, right? You only have 0, 1, and 2, so you wouldn't want to just do dataset.length there. But with the modulus, you could do a dataset.length -1, I suppose, right? As a bound, keeping it, use a conditional and keeping it between those two. But this, anyway, this really helps to, with this modulus, it helps to make the data go in a loop all the way around, like I showed just a second ago. So anyway, so this is obviously, I didn't use the button back. That's maybe, I might add that later, add it so you can go backwards through the data, but since there's only 3, reviews, it's not a big deal. If there was like 10, I'd have it so you can go back and forth, kind of like what the site used to be. So here's the button. So I added a button to, let's see here, where are the buttons? The reviews. So we have, right here, you have the main image, and then you have the logo, and then here's the button right here. So that's the button for next review. So when you come back over here, right? So that's the button right there. And then this is the counter where it starts. And I guess I had it start at 1 initially because when you have the initial render, you don't want it to show 0 again, right? You want it to go 1, and then it goes 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3 as it goes through. Otherwise, it would show the same data, the same review after the initial render. It would show it again on the first click, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So anyway, so here's the display. I showed you display.innerHTML, and display is this right here, where the reviews are. So you see, reviews right here, right? So that's where it's being all appended to the DOM, right? So that's the reviews, that's the node, and then it takes that inner HTML, and then it goes through each part of the JSON data and puts it inside using a template literal. You got basically element.rating, element.text. Now element is the data set, right? So element equals data set. So here, right there is the initial render, but down here I made element within this function equal, so element equals data set, and then it goes through the data, and the counter is whatever this equals, right? So initially it equals 1, then it goes 0, it goes 1, then it goes 2, then it goes 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and it's able to go 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2 because of this modulus here. That helps it loop like continuously through. So as you see here, these are the elements. So by element, what I'm essentially saying is part of the data set. So the data set itself, when it comes through, see here, is this, right? So payload.reviews, it goes through each of those. So when you come here, let's see. A little slowly. So here's payload.reviews. Then it says, okay, cool. This is the counter, right? This is what the counter initially, it equals 1, but it keeps going through there. Then it goes element dot. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is element dot rating, then element dot text, then element dot, I guess, read the full review. So the URL, and then the user, and it goes to the user, and I think user.name or something, right? So element.rating, element.text. Here's the link. Link is element.url, and then the element.user.name. I had to use a little more dot notation there because element.user. So element.user.name. Okay, so pretty straightforward. I think that the biggest problem that I wanted to solve, or the thing that the functionality was to be able to loop through the different, instead of just displaying all the reviews, to be able to loop through them. And this click through data function allows that to happen. Again, I'll put all this links to the code in the description because I think this is a pretty good use case. It can be useful. I guess one of the programming mantras is copy paste amend or copy paste tweak. I would say understand. I would bookend those with understand, then copy paste tweak understand, right? Or copy paste amend understand. Or understand what's going on with the code, then copy paste amend it, and then make sure you understand what's really going on, instead of just sort of copying and praying it works. So yeah, that's kind of a quick overview of how that works. Obviously, so payload is called here, and within payload you have these two functions here. The initial render, which initially shows the first review, and then you're able to click through the data using this code here. There are some console logs here just so I can do some testing. Like I'd console log the counter just to see how that worked, make sure that was working properly. But yeah, it's interesting because it's just showing as you're clicking through, it's just showing the counter is allowing it just to show one review at a time, because this counter, one of the first things I learned in programming is right in here, dataset.counter. Well, that counter is being incremented right here, and you're able to go through each part of the data set. So each one of these, each one, 0, 1, and 2, individually, right? Using the click-through event and the counter. And then I guess it's really kind of an interesting use case for the modulus there, to use that modulus here to be able to loop through the data. So yeah, there you have it. That's the evolution of this review section in the site itself. Like this site still, I could totally improve this. Obviously, it still has the animation there. Originally, we used transitions and transforms in CSS, but this is done with jQuery, and it's interesting too because so I took a picture of this almost 10 years ago now, and then I put it in Photoshop, and it's not even, I can make this cleaner, but this is when I first started, and I put it into Photoshop, and I did some work in Photoshop to create, they didn't really have an official logo or anything to give us, and so I created that on the fly, like, okay, I can tweak this, make it even different, but they're not really hiring us to do a logo, at least at this time. So, but we should have something here, because originally there wasn't even, if you look at the original site, this wasn't even here. It was just like Steve's Cafe and all this, which looked okay, but I was like, man, there's something missing here. And it's funny, I don't know why this popped in my head, but we had to review each other in our group and say good things and things that we can improve. And somebody said in the group that I had a designer type personality or something like that. I don't know if that means I'm mercurial at times or just like, have that stereotypical artistic personality. Something I had as a designer, the demeanor of a designer. And it's interesting because sometimes people see you better than you see yourself. And a designer doesn't mean you just do designs in Figma, or even at the time we had like Fireworks, that program, I think it was called, or people were even doing designs in Photoshop. We didn't have like the Adobe XD and the Figma and Sketch and things like that. But it's cool because especially now designers still code. They know enough code. That's why I say I would call myself a UX engineer. So some of you might feel the same way. I mean, there's totally different titles. You're going to ask someone to define the same job title, and they're going to give you a different definition. But for me, I just look at it as a combination of UX design and front-end development to the point where you get to the middle tier and deal with some of that stuff. So, like I said, a good example of that is if you see a job description of being able to take Figma designs and tweak them and create either React apps or React websites or something with React or Angular or Vue or something like that. One of those libraries / frameworks, etc. So kind of looping back to the impetus of this video and where I started, 10 years ago, about ready to go back to school. I had a conception of what it would mean for me to be a web developer, right? There's so many different definitions of that. I started on my career journey. It became pretty apparent that there might not be a niche for what I really want to do, or there might not be a demand for what I envisioned. I got a little discouraged. I almost quit. I was like, maybe I made a mistake. But now I'm seeing job descriptions that look like I wrote those descriptions 10 years ago. And it's that whole idea of looping back every 10 years that Richard Linklater brought up. I thought when I heard it, I was like, maybe. I mean, at the time that I was pretty young, so 10 years didn't really mean anything in terms of career, right? But now I look back 10 years, I'm like, yeah, he was right, at least in my case. 10 years ago, my vision was what it is right now, but now I'm more knowledgeable, more skilled, and I've progressed, but I'm really back to where I was, and I'm able to look back and say, okay, I continued on the journey despite being discouraged at times. That's good. The tenacity was there. Perhaps the saying, when your passion exceeds your fear, you found your career, applied to me. Even though I can overthink things with the best of them, I still kept on that track. So anyway, this is Brian Kidd, your holistic programmer, signing off. I hope you have a wonderful summer and keep the faith for sure. Another mantra I have is courage, confidence, strength, and faith. The courage, confidence, strength part is sometimes pretty easy to want easy, but that's the easier part. Let's say the faith part is the hardest part of that equation. Courage, confidence, strength, and faith. Good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching another edition of The Holistic Programmer. For more details, please see video information. Please support by pressing the like button.